Hey guys, Rominating Reaper here. So I'm outside the cinema and I'm ready to go in and see one that I have been really looking forward to. 28 years later, The Bone Temple. Yes, this is coming a mere 28 weeks after part 1, which I absolutely loved. Just a big, ambitious, bold film that takes big swings. So I'm really excited to see how they build on that, especially that quite bonkers ending. So yeah, I've been really excited for this. Love the franchise as well. So yeah, I'm really excited to see how they expand on it and continue it. The only way to find out if it's actually any good is to head in, get some snacks, and get seated for 28 years later, The Bone Temple. So yeah, I've got my popcorn here and a red frozen Fanta, colour of rage-infected blood, ready for part 2 of the 28 years later story. So, 28 years later, The Bone Temple. I'm back from seeing it. This time around, instead of Danny Boyle directing, this one is directed by Nia DaCosta, director of Candyman and The Marvels. It is still written by Alex Garland though, and exec produced by Cillian Murphy. Now look, I loved part 1. It was just such a bold, ambitious film that did not play itself safe and went in really, really interesting directions. And so obviously off the back of that, and just that absolutely bonkers ending, I was really looking forward to this one to see how they would build on that. But is this a worthy continuation to the story set up in part 1? Let's find out. So in the film, Spike finds himself reluctantly teaming up with Sir Jimmy Crystal and his gang of Jimmies as they make their way across the deserted wasteland, laying waste to those infected by the rage virus, while also finding survivors to carry out acts of charity in the name of their lord, Old Nick. Meanwhile, Dr. Ian Kelson, still residing by his Bone Temple, makes a huge discovery about the infection that could potentially change everything. So obviously after how bold and ambitious part 1 was, my expectations for this one were high. Now I know part 1 proved to be quite divisive. Obviously it was loved in film circles, but I don't think general audiences really got on with the direction it went in. But thankfully, as somebody in the former camp, I can safely say that I loved this one as well. Now, what's notable about this one is that it has a more straightforward and conventional approach compared to that of part 1, and I think a lot more casual cinema goers will gel with this one. And obviously that particularly shows in the film's form and presentation, where obviously part 1 was shot on iPhones and it gave it quite an interesting look and texture. This one is shot on just regular digital cameras and it gives the whole thing a much different look and feel, and yet I think it really works for what this one is going for. Obviously there's a lot of really great looking shots here. I really enjoyed how they still bring that, color and vibrance to this post-apocalyptic world, particularly with the sky and how it, changes color throughout the day, particularly in a gloriously done time-lapse sequence. It is just beautiful. There's also some quite striking shots of the titular Monument to the Dead that really call back to the sort of shots of buildings in Candyman. It is just an absolute feast for the eyes, and it works really well for the approach to the story here, where obviously it's a much smaller scale story, but still really moves things forward in a big way. Particularly with the new layers we get about the infection and Samson, the alpha, that really changes the game in a way that I'm excited to see further explored in part 3, which, yes, was recently greenlit. And speaking of the infection, the film really delivers on the horror as well. The thing maintains obviously quite a suspenseful and tense atmosphere throughout, and obviously encounters with the infected are just as fast paced and shaky as you'd hope for, and they really deliver on the brutal violence. There's also some great moments of brutal violence that come from the Jimmies as well. You know, people are getting skinned and burned alive. At one point, there's a leg slicing that is, yeah, if you're squeamish, it might get quite hard to watch, and it really, really earns its 18 rating. And there's also a couple jump scares in here that actually really caught me off guard. It is incredibly well done, and it's all enhanced by a score from Hildur Gudnadottir here that really enhances the quite, tense vibe of the world. And it's contrasted quite nicely with a well-deployed selection of licensed songs too. All I'm saying is, if you're a big fan of Duran Duran, yeah, you're in luck. There's also a Radiohead needle drop that is just glorious. Now, I think where its limitations kind of show as a middle part is in a subplot involving a pregnant woman that feels like it's building to something bigger but doesn't really go anywhere. Now, I assume that something bigger will arrive potentially in part 3. I don't know, but what I know for now is that, you're very much left waiting for that something bigger that hasn't yet arrived, but it more than makes up for that with obviously that thematic core. Now, obviously, this is where part 1 really shined, and here they obviously bring new ideas to the table that obviously expand on and complement part 1's themes quite nicely. Obviously, the core driving this one is a sort of look at the whole religion versus science debate. And obviously, religion represented by Sir Jimmy and the Jimmies, and they're sort of calling driven by their faith to their Lord, Old Nick. And yeah, Jack O'Connell and his quite erratic personality as Jimmy, he is just fantastic as this just sadistic, utterly psychotic, basically cult leader. And oh my god, he is so utterly frightening in like every scene. He is just brilliant. Honestly, I think he's found his niche as just terrifying horror movie villains. He is great. Now, obviously, yes, on the flip side of things, we have the sort of science angle represented by the quite gentle and quietly empathetic and methodically minded Dr. Kelson, who's played in yet another brilliant turn from Ralph Fiennes. And the way these two contrast each other makes for really, really interesting stuff. And it serves the sort of expansion of Spike's coming of age journey from part 1, where here he's challenged to find where his values truly align. And once again, man, Alfie Williams is just brilliant. There's also kind of an interesting thing at play here of sort of, finding the inherent goodness of mankind in, troubled and difficult times. Obviously, we have, Dr. Kelson, who's quite an empathetic and, measured figure. And we also have that explored through Jimmy Inc., played by Aaron Kellyman, who's a more sympathetic member of Sir Jimmy's crew, who, kind of bonds with Spike. It's all incredibly interesting stuff, and does lead to some quite well done, touching moments. But of course, it all builds to an absolutely glorious climax that I think a lot of audiences are going to love. There is an action moment in this. You'll know exactly the one I'm talking about when you see it. That is just electric. And there's also a sequence here that, without exaggeration, we're only a few weeks into 2026, and I think there's one sequence in here that, hands down, it might just be the most metal thing of of the whole year. It is glorious and delivers those big twists and turns, and also, yes, those quieter, touching moments, and also really effectively sets the table for part three to round out the story with a big, exciting character return that, obviously you already know who it is, and the film knows that you know, and just kind of just casually delivers it and really brilliantly sets the table for what's to come next. And I, for one, cannot wait for part three. Overall, 28 years later, The Bone Temple is a wonderful continuation of part one that, while certainly more straightforward and conventional in its smaller scale story, still delivers the horror and interesting emotional themes at play to really make it a worthy follow-up. Out of 10, 28 years later, The Bone Temple gets a 9. So, let me know down in the comments, have you seen 28 years later, The Bone Temple? What did you think of it? What did you make of it in comparison to part 1? And are you excited to see how the story will conclude in part 3? Let me know all that down in the comments. Don't forget to hit the thumbs up button if you enjoyed. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button if you're new. And don't forget to turn on post notifications so you don't miss an upload.